Well, Jeff, today we're going to be experiencing an infestation.
What?
Infestation.
Are you talking about the governor, Festus?
Oh, yes.
Okay, well,
Him.
he's Chris and I'm Jeff, and we're the Bible guys. Okay, Chris. I don't know.
You tried to say it too early.
That's
Okay,
right.
Chris.
All right. Well,
Hey.
I'm just so excited about this one.
I always say it, and I have to say it again. I love the Babylon Bee segments.
That's right. Well, we only get the best news for people and the highest quality. And so our favorite kind of news is satire.
Right.
And so the Babylon Bee is always satire. There's a very important article that I thought was going to be important for you personally.
Yes.
When I saw this, I thought this is going to really mean something to you. Here's the headline. Japanese admit that sushi was just a massive prank to see if they could get people to eat raw fish.
Which is great, because it's my favorite food.
Yeah, I know. You love sushi. We just had sushi together.
We did. We did, yeah.
So the Prime Minister of Japan admitted today that sushi was just a giant prank by the people of Japan to see if they could get people to actually eat raw fish. We got you good, laughed Prime Minister Fumio Kishida. It's been so hard keeping a straight face watching you dopes eat raw fish. This is the best prank in the history of pranks. The joke reportedly started in 1974. It was hatched by the Prime Minister's chef during a visit by President Gerald Ford. Just for giggles, the chef put a piece of raw fish on Mr. Ford's plate and said it was Japanese tradition to eat it that way, said historian Amiko Nakaya. To everyone's shock, Mr. Ford proceeded to take a huge bite of raw tuna. The Prime Minister had to leave the room as he couldn't hide his laughter. Thus, sushi was born.
That's so funny.
Ever since the prank's inception, Japanese chefs have taken delight in creating progressively more disgusting creations to see what people will eat. It's insane. We can roll up raw fish and literal seaweed, but then call it a dragon roll, and people will eat it,
That's
said
the
Chef
best.
Haruko Takai.
I love dragon rolls.
The other day, one of the other chefs dared me to put fish eggs on top of raw squid and call it Emperor's Delight. A dozen people ate it. Oh, man, I was gagging behind the counter just watching them. The Japanese people also admitted that they came up with the idea of karaoke just to watch people make idiots of themselves.
Oh, my goodness. That is so funny. Just the idea that they are sitting behind the scenes going,
the
I
whole
can't
thing's
believe
fake.
you ate it.
Yeah, you crazy people.
Oh,
And
it's
you
so
do it,
good.
man. You love it.
Oh, I love sushi.
You'd eat sushi every day?
I mean, it'd be too high in mercury. I couldn't do it, but I got to tell you, my taste buds would want to.
Yeah. You love it? What's your favorite?
Love it.
For all of our sushi listeners out there.
To be honest with you, my go-to is a rainbow roll.
Mm-hmm.
So it's pretty much a California roll with an overlay of different types of raw fish. So then they slice it. So sometimes you'll get like just avocado laid over. And sometimes you'll get, salmon, then you get whitefish, then you get, my favorite, which is the salmon, then you get the raw tuna, and then I think then shrimp
Okay.
as well.
Yeah.
So those are the ones.
So you love it.
Oh, love it.
Yeah.
Love it.
So I like, if you ever go and you're not sure, to our listeners, if you're not sure whether or not you like sushi, just order it tempura. That means they fry it.
Right. And anything fried has to be good.
Anything fried is going to be good. Yeah. So we were in East Africa one time. We were in Dar es Salaam, and we had a bunch of the African pastors with us. And we had an evening that was kind of free. And so Chad, our executive pastor, and I, we were like, hey, let's go to the sushi place. It's supposed to be the best sushi place in East Africa. It's right on the Indian Ocean. And so we invited several of these pastors, and they got there and they said, they don't cook the fish? We said no. And they're like, we are not eating this stuff.
Right.
And so they ordered, we ordered a couple other things, and they ate all the appetizers, they ate everything else, but they wouldn't eat the sushi for a long time. Finally, one of the guys tried it, and, Chad was showing him, put it on the ginger, put it on the, what's the green stuff?
Wasabi and
the
soy
wasabi,
sauce.
and then put a little soy sauce. It's like umami in your mouth. Is so good. And so one of the guys tried it because and next thing you know, he's just hitting it hard. And next thing you know, all these guys, they just, it was like a vacuum cleaner. So they went for 30 minutes, wouldn't touch it. And like in 7 minutes, every piece of sushi was gone.
That's
so they
awesome.
went from being afraid of it to loving it. Right. And I think a lot of times people are just afraid of what they don't know.
Well, you just described the journey for every person who tries raw fish for the first time.
Yeah.
Right? Oh, no. That's not everybody's journey. But everybody who continues to love
Everybody
it.
who loves sushi.
Yeah, everybody who loves sushi says, I was afraid of it, And then I tried it. And I love it.
Yeah, it's fun. It's fun to try new things. But as it turns out, according to the Babylon Bee, it was always a prank. It was never supposed to be taken serious.
That concept is really, really funny.
Okay. Yeah. So yesterday, we talked a little bit about how Festus's job kind of comes to an end during this 2-year...
Felix's.
Felix's job comes to an end at the end of this 2-year period, and then God has the Roman Empire appoint this guy named Festus, and Festus comes in. He's a man of integrity, and so he decides, hey, this is crazy. We're leaving this Roman citizen, without having finished this trial.
So if Felix was the predecessor to Pontius Pilate,
he was successor,
not predecessor,
right?
Then Porcius Festus was the
he comes after Felix.
The successor.
So it's the same
Felix.
job that Pilate had.
Right
Now is the governor of Judea.
Which, by the way, is interesting because I'm not sure I ever thought about that before.
Yeah. Same guy.
Yeah, interesting.
Same role.
Same role.
So it says 3 days after Festus arrived in Caesarea to take over his new responsibilities, he left for Jerusalem, where the leading priests and other Jewish leaders met with him and made their accusations against Paul. They asked Festus as a favor to transfer Paul to Jerusalem, planning to ambush him and kill him on the way. They'd already failed at this 2 years before, but they're going to do it again,
They're going to do it again.
But Festus replied that Paul was at Caesarea, and he himself would be returning there soon. So he said, those of you in authority can return with me. If Paul's done anything wrong, you can make your accusations. About 8 or 10 days later, Festus returned to Caesarea, and on the following day, he took his seat in court, ordered that Paul be brought in. When Paul arrived, the Jewish leaders from Jerusalem gathered around and made many serious accusations they couldn't prove. Paul denied the charges. I'm not guilty of any crime against the Jewish laws, or the temple, or the Roman government, he said. Then Festus, wanting to please the Jews, asked him, are you willing to go to Jerusalem and stand trial before me there? But Paul replied, no. This is the official Roman court, so I ought to be tried here. You know very well I'm not guilty of harming the Jews. If I've done something worthy of death, I don't refuse to die. But if I'm innocent, no one has a right to turn me over to these men to kill me. I appeal to Caesar. Festus conferred with his advisors, and then he replied, very well, you've appealed to Caesar, and to Caesar you will go. A few days later, King Agrippa arrived with his sister Bernice to pay their respects to Festus. During their stay of several days, Festus discussed Paul's case with the king. There's a prisoner here, he told him, whose case was left for me by Felix. When I was in Jerusalem, the leading priests and Jewish elders pressed charges against him and asked me to condemn him. I pointed out to them that Roman law does not convict people without a trial. They must be given an opportunity to confront their accusers, defend themselves. When his accusers came here for the trial, I didn't delay. I called the case the very next day, ordered Paul brought in. But the accusations made against him weren't of any crimes I expected. Instead, it was something about their religion and a dead man named Jesus, who Paul insists is alive. I was at a loss to know how to investigate these things, so I asked him whether or not he would be willing to stand trial on these charges in Jerusalem. But Paul appealed to have his case decided by the emperor. So I ordered that he be held in custody until I could arrange to send him to Caesar. I'd like to hear the man myself, Agrippa said, and Festus replied, you will, tomorrow.
Are we reading all the way through, or are we done?
Isn't that where it ends?
Yep, you're right.
Okay.
So that's so interesting, isn't it? And
Yeah.
so he appeals to Caesar, and Festus, of course, shows his integrity by not, doing the favor of letting Paul be, killed. And, and Paul just sticks to his guns.
Yeah.
When I hear the word Agrippa, you know what I think of? Unless
Losing it?
No. I think of, unless his enemy has studied his Agrippa, which I have. That's a line from a movie.
Princess Bride?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Remember? And then he jumps over and he flips and he says, unless his enemy has studied his Agrippa.
That's right.
That's funny.
My name is Inigo Montoya.
Yes.
You killed my father, prepare to die.
Yes. So King Herod Agrippa, by the way, I also named a mop King Agrippa when I was a janitor for a year or 2 years in college. We had these mops that would, the mop heads would have to be gripped, and so these things would loosen up and they would grip the mop head. Then you have to sort of fasten it down, and I wanted that mop, and so I put a big piece of tape on it. I called it King Agrippa.
King Agrippa.
It's another memory that has no bearing on this
it has
podcast.
nothing whatsoever, but thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, well,
it's just rattling around. It's a random fact rattling around in your skull.
People are so interested in,
in
these things.
Like, wow, Chris is so interesting.
Yes.
He once had a mop named King Agrippa.
Here's an idea. Talk about the Bible you just read. That's so good.
Yep, the mop guys. So there were a few King Agrippas, by the way. So this King Agrippa is King Agrippa II. He's the son of King Agrippa I, which is clever.
Yes, it is clever.
And the grandson of, I think, Herod the Great. Is that right? Yeah, his great-grandfather and his grandfather and his father all had the name Herod, right? They were all kings. And but Herod the Great was in his line as well. So these guys are basically power players that have some authority, but mostly they're tax collector type guys, and they kind of work alongside of a governor. So where the governor, like Pontius Pilate or Felix or now Festus, they were more on the legal side of things and commanding the Roman garrison. The Agrippas or the Herods, they were kings that had a lot of authority, but were really more about being embedded in the region of Israel, in Judea, rather than being spread all over the Roman Empire. Like Festus, Felix, Pilate, they come and go. They come in, they serve a term, they stay a certain amount of time, and then they leave. The Herod family stays in power for a long period of time and kind of rules alongside of them. That's how that works. But every one of these Herods is crooked. Every one of them.
Yeah, it says each generation had a confrontation with God but failed to realize the importance of the moment.
Each generation of Herods?
Of Herods, yeah.
Yeah.
It says Herod Agrippa II's great uncle, Herod Antipas, actually met Jesus during the trial, but failed to see him for who he was.
Right. Remember, he left Pilate and Pilate sent him to go see Herod.
Right.
Herod wanted him to do miracles.
Jesus was the hot potato back then.
That's right. And Herod wanted Jesus to do miracles, and Jesus wouldn't do any miracles. So Herod got bored and sent him back to Pilate.
Right. That's right. And it says Agrippa II heard the gospel from Paul, but considered the message only mildly entertaining. And by the way, we're about to read and get into that later on, right? He found it humorous that Paul actually tried to convince him to become a Christian.
Right.
So as we're about to see, right? Yeah. So he thinks that's humorous.
Yeah.
So that's interesting. So this narrative of Paul being, bounced around, obviously it's got to be really bad in order for Paul to yell out, "I appeal to Caesar." And I would guess that Festus that was the best news Festus could have heard.
Yeah, it would have been surprising because that's a pretty final thing, right? And I think they were all, Festus doesn't seem to be, but Felix was looking for a bribe. Clearly, the Herods would have taken a bribe, right? They all were pretty bad. So it mentions Bernice here. So Bernice was a sister, a stepsister of different people she was having affairs with. She winds up going on and becoming a mistress of Titus, the son of the emperor. She's not a good person either. These people are just antithetical to everything Paul was about. But Paul is showing gentleness and peace with them and trying to share the gospel as best he can. He's not being judgmental towards them. But when Festus gives him the opportunity, hey, are you going to go back? You willing to go back to Jerusalem? He's just trying to get rid of him at this point. And he goes, absolutely not. If he had just stopped there, he probably could have still avoided going to Jerusalem because they couldn't find any reason to execute him. But instead, he said, I appeal to Caesar. I'm a Roman citizen. I appeal to Caesar. And that guaranteed now the next 8-9 years, he's on his way to Rome the whole time.
Right? Isn't it interesting to see the tenacity of the crowd of these people who wanted Paul dead?
Yeah.
I mean, here he's been.
It's unreasonable.
Yes, it's unreasonable. but they want him. They want him gone because they now understand that he has become just as big of a threat in many ways as Jesus was.
Yeah.
Obviously, there's no comparison.
Right, but they were feeling that way. They were treating it like
they were feeling it that way because what they were seeing was the effect of.
That's right.
Because in their
Christianity
mind,
was spreading so fast.
Right.
Jesus had 120 followers.
Right.
At the upper room, right after his resurrection. But now there's hundreds of thousands of Christians all over the Roman Empire. So yeah, it would have maybe seemed like it was a bigger deal with Paul.
Yeah, because again, when we look at Jesus compared to Paul, we say it's no comparison because of who Jesus is and who Paul is. But they didn't really recognize it that way.
Right.
They were just like, the amount of trouble that this guy gave us versus the amount of trouble that this guy gave us.
It's getting worse.
It's getting worse.
These followers of the way, man, is spreading everywhere.
Yeah.
They're turning the world upside down. And later Paul writes about, though, and I love this. Paul writes a little later, he'll say, we don't fight against flesh and blood. So he didn't see these people as his enemies. He said it's a spiritual battle that's happening. And so, it seems unreasonable. If this is just a human issue, fighting against, Paul, then they would have eventually lost interest, right? It just would have gone away. But I believe that this is a supernatural, demonic fight against Paul. Take him out of this fight. Take him out of his influence and impact. And, Paul's just facing it with grace and kindness and all this stuff. But, we've mentioned before that, when you're telling a narrative, when you're in the Bible and you're reading doctrinal passages and Paul's just telling us how to live or how to behave, that is all for our benefit, either to know how God works from a technical aspect doctrinally, or how we should live practically, right? The application side of it. But when we read these narratives like this, and, it's several chapters here in a row of just telling the story, the Bible says that God gave us these things, told us these stories of ancient times for our benefit. And so we look for what are the things that we can take away for our benefit. One of them is Paul's grace under fire, under pressure. And the fact that he wasn't afraid to leverage his position. His position was, I'm a Roman citizen. I don't have to go to Jerusalem where these crooks and these crooked people are going to try to kill me, right? I'm going to Rome. And so he pulled the levers that were available to him without manipulating. He didn't manipulate the system. He just pulled the levers that were available to him in the moment. And there's some advantage, I think, Jesus taught us to be wise as serpents and harmless as doves, to understand how the world works. There's one point where Jesus is frustrated with his disciples. They're talking about money issues and things, and Jesus is a little frustrated, going, how is it that the people of the world know this, but you don't know these things? And you need to be as harmless as doves, but you need to be wise as serpents. And so here's Paul being gentle. Paul's being peaceful. He's defending himself, but he's also a wise person. He knows all the tools available to him. And at this point, rather than going and getting assassinated on the road back to Jerusalem, he pulls the lever and goes, nope, I'm appealing to Caesar. That was the next level up, and that solved everybody's problem.
Yeah, well, it solved Festus's problem because he wanted to get rid of him.
Yeah.
And, even back when you talked about Jesus being the hot potato, it was sort of that way back then as well. We noticed that, he appears in front of Pilate, and you know what Pilate says? Pilate says, I just want this to be somebody else's problem, right? So that they send him to Caiaphas, then he bounces back to Herod. He's back and forth because everybody just didn't want to have to deal with it, and all they really want to do is they want to just keep the peace.
Right.
So just like Pilate, again, same exact position.
Right.
Festus just wants to keep the peace because that's what he's charged with.
And Festus can't even really figure out what's going on, which is funny, right? He's like, what?
Right.
This must be a bad guy. I mean, Felix kept him here for 2 years. Must be a bad guy. And then he's down in Jerusalem, and the high priest goes, "Hey, we want Paul executed." And Festus goes, "Well, hey, I'm going back to Caesarea. Why don't you just bring some people?" So they come back again, but when he's trying to explain to Herod, Herod shows up with Bernice, and he goes, "I called the case the very next day and ordered Paul brought in, but the accusations made against him weren't any of the crimes I expected. Instead," and this is what's so funny, "it was something about their religion and a dead man named Jesus, who Paul says is alive, and I was at a loss to know what to do or how to investigate these things." Festus is like, that's what this is about?
Right.
Some dead guy named Jesus, and Paul says he's been resurrected. And, it reminds me of when Paul writes, he said, that the things of God are foolishness to the world.
Right.
And Festus is not thinking about the things of God.
1 Corinthians 1:18.
Yeah. And Festus is not thinking about the things of God. Festus is just trying to figure out how to get his job done, and he's brand new at it.
Yeah.
And apparently this guy must be a bad guy because Felix kept him for a long time. And then he goes, "What? Some dead guy's alive?"
Right. Right. Yeah.
That's what he's arrested about.
And by the way, it's the exact wording is, instead, it was something about.
Yeah, right.
Right. Like I don't even know what he said.
I don't
right?
even.
Some dead guy named Jesus. Something about their religion. I was thinking it was actually going to be a crime.
Right.
Because you Jews and your little religious, whatever you guys have going on, it's no concern to us,
Yeah.
but because I'm assigned to keep the peace, and because apparently it's a big deal to you,
Yeah.
right? I've got to deal with this. So then he sends him on to Caesar. I'm telling you, it's the best news for Festus he could have probably heard.
That's right.
But anyway, yeah, you're right. We look at Paul, and we try to take examples like what does this mean for us, and what we can see in story narratives like this one is that there's character by the words that he uses, by his actions. For instance, we know that he's still sharing the gospel. We know that he's not appealing. We know that he's keeping his integrity.
Yeah.
But then also there's things that are present that aren't written, right? So we can learn just as much from what he didn't do
Yes.
than what he did do.
Yep.
Right? Because he could have done all sorts of things.
Yeah.
And had you and I been in that position, we might find ourselves doing all sorts of things.
Sure, but instead, what he leaves is precisely, and if you'll indulge me for a second, what I take away from this passage is Festus had no concept of the Jewish faith. He had no concept of the faith of the people of the way, this dead guy named Jesus. And when he leaves his encounter with Paul, this first encounter with Paul, he doesn't understand it all, but he definitely knows Jesus rose from the dead. Those two things are central. And I wonder, when people confront us, do they leave only going, I don't understand everything he said, but apparently these are his political views?
Right.
Well, then maybe I missed it. Or I don't know what he said, but apparently he doesn't like those kind of people or that kind of lifestyle or whatever. And they know the things we're against, or they know the things that, but what Festus, who doesn't understand it all, comes away going, Jesus is the center of their faith system, and they believe he was risen from the dead, right? That's really the core. So if you're trying to figure out how do you share your faith, it's not about arguing all the things you're against. It's about saying Jesus is the answer, and God raised him from the dead, right? That's it. And so Paul, I think, did a great job. At least if that's all Festus took away from it, Paul did a great job of presenting the gospel.
Yeah, and it's a great policy to actually say, as Christians, people should not necessarily know what we're against as much as they should know what we're for.
Right, and we're for Jesus,
We're
the
for
resurrected
Jesus.
Son of God.
Yeah, that's right.
Yep.
And we're for all the positivity that God wants to bring, from the church, the change that God wants to bring about from the church. We need to stand for what we're for. Be about those things. Be talking about those things. Be bragging about those things. Spending your words and your energy and your time on all the things that we're for, not the things that we're against.
But if they only know one thing in this spiritual conversation you had with them, Jesus is the Son of God, God raised him from the dead. Some guy named Jesus.
Who he insists is still alive.
Yeah, good job, Paul.
Yeah.
Right?
I think that's a great place to end. So we'll see you next time on The Bible Guys.